I received a seemingly absurd question from the audience, and I'm going to do the man who asked the question and all of you in the audience the favor of treating it quite seriously and not dismissing it as absurd. And that question is democracy. What really is the point? What really fundamentally is the advantage? I'll read his precise wording in just a moment, but let me steel man the question for you this way. If we were to admit that a kingdom or a despotism is only as good as the cluster of men who happen to be ruling at the top, wouldn't it be fair to suppose that a democracy is only as good as that cluster of men who are ruling, be they at the bottom or the top or the middle? If what we're talking about in government really is the goodness of the people who happen to comprise the government and how well those people can work together. Very interesting criterion. What really would be the advantage of democracy? What's the advantage of having a larger number of people in government, which has some obvious disadvantages? And then also, if they're all terrible people anyway, would you rather have a despotism by a highly educated, highly enlightened, highly erudite few, or would you rather have government by the many if they are perhaps very poorly educated or have particular religious and social values you may disagree with? Let's make this a lot less impalpable and talk about Afghanistan. Let's talk about even Indonesia. Let's talk about Egypt. How much popular democracy do you want? If you're in a country where the majority of people are conservative Muslims and where there is perhaps an erudite, enlightened, educated minority who have more secular, more modern, more pragmatic values. Would you prefer to live in Iran if Iran has democracy? And they do today. They have a mixed or imperfect democratic system, but Iran has elections. Iran has freedom of the press. But you know who the people of Iran tend to elect? They tend to elect governments that reflect their own deeply conservative Muslim values and agenda, right? So it's very easy to look at that and say, oh, I personally would be more comfortable living in Iran if it happened to have a dictatorship, happened to have a monarchy that more closely resembled my own Western, secular, supposedly enlightened values. Yes, how easy this line of reasoning is. Very few people really think this stuff through rigorously, partly just because every political persuasion, left, right, and center, is forever praising democracy. You will find that both communists and fascists, even when they criticize democracy, will very often turn around and pretend or presuppose that their own political agenda is leading to a more perfect democracy, a more authentic democracy, that they represent the true democracy, even while they're screaming to tear democracy down. I've certainly heard communists with absolutely zero irony claim that in 1917, the Leninists, by killing all the people who won the election, we're doing something much more democratic than allowing the people that won the elections to rule, because really it's only the factory workers who should have the right to vote anyway. People deeply commit to different ideas and ideals of democratic legitimacy, and they can more easily switch between one ideal than another than they can challenge the fundamental presuppositions of democracy as such and ask, well, wait, is it what was this advantage of democracy supposed to be? Why is it that we suppose a democratic society is the best kind of society? All right, the actual wording of the question I received from Maximilian was, quote, I would be interested in knowing what the benefits of and philosophical basis for, quote unquote, democratic decision making would be. I close quote. He then gives a whole list of sources that he's read that are criticizing and cross-examining democracy and expressing skepticism about the rationality of voter behavior and the viability of democracy as an ideal as such. And he very vaguely says to me that he's interested in alternatives that are neither democracy nor dictatorship, but more market-based solutions. So I assume that's some kind of capitalist libertarian ideal he's talking about. I genuinely can't imagine. Okay, the problem with your approach, Maximilian, is that you are thinking of government in terms of ruling, and you're not thinking of government in terms of asking questions, in terms of active research and informed opinion. And without insulting you, Maximilian, you probably do not have experience living in or studying or researching non-democratic societies and the normal course of government in completely non-democratic systems, how that unfolds, how it is that power operates where nobody can ask questions, where nobody can initiate new forms of research and inquiry within government or by independent bodies using that research and inquiry, frankly, to shame the government. Right? I remember reading a detailed account from Vietnam. It's surreal to read about the politics of Vietnam from their long, hard, unapologetic communist period, which I would say basically hasn't ended. They still have a communist government, but with a capitalist economy now. And at one of these meetings, who were the senior military commanders, the generalissimos in this dictatorship, they sat down. This is an annual meeting where they had a series of bullet points for discussion. And one of them was basically about poverty. And the guy in charge of the meeting remarked when he saw this on the agenda of things they were going to discuss, and he said, "Oh, this is the first time we've discussed a social issue at one of these meetings in 12 years. Someone had gone and looked, when was the last time we talked about poverty? Or when was the last time one of these elite level meetings? It's in Myanmar, currently they're having protests in the street about whether or not they will have any democracy. But just a few years ago, I'm sorry, I could have Googled this to get the date correct, but just a few years ago, I was following the politics of Myanmar as they made the transition from total military dictatorship to this kind of mixed managed system where they did have a parliament and they did have some freedom of the press. And the parliament was able to ask questions of the military dictatorship. But by the way, the military dictatorship never really went away. It became a military dictatorship with some democracy and a sort of parliament. And one of the very first parliamentary sessions in this period of Burmese history, somebody got up and started asking questions about electricity. How much electricity was being generated and where? And the military dictatorship, who had been controlling the government for decades, basically, they made a transition from a socialist system to a military dictatorship that didn't have the pretensions of socialism. But the socialist period also was basically despotic, for want of a better term, from tyrannical socialism to outright military dictatorship. So decades and decades and decades with no semblance of democracy whatsoever. And what they found was nobody had the numbers. Nobody was doing the math. They did have power stations generating electricity. And of course, they had people complaining that there wasn't enough. Nobody had ever gotten out a map or said, oh, how much electricity are we generating in each place? And of course, the obvious question is that enough? And who's satisfied and who's not? And should there be more power over here and less there? And where should we build the next station? And where do we need to build more power lines? There was absolutely no questioning. Now, these examples are kind of easy. And if you stop and reflect on the absence of questioning in completely non-democratic institutions within your own life, it starts to become much more disturbing. Hospitals are completely non-democratic, completely authoritarian institutions. Universities are completely non-democratic, completely authoritarian institutions. Who's in charge here? You're not allowed to ask. Why is that guy in charge? Nobody has to tell you why. What were his credentials? How was he selected, given that he never was elected? Who is he responsible to? Who is he accountable to? What if nobody in the Department of Chinese is actually learning Chinese? What if the guy in charge of the Buddhist Studies Department is a drunk or a drug addict? Not unprecedented. University professors become alcoholics. University professors become drug addicts. We had one guy in Canada, he basically became a Nazi, stayed in power for many, many years, was in the newspapers spreading his so-called race realism for decades. It's ridiculous. But they may not have been at the time they were hired, right? Oh, well, there was a hiring committee at one point that decided this person should be a professor. But once they were anointed, once they were elevated to this level of being a A university professor, nobody is allowed to question them. Nobody's allowed to cross-examine them. And questions of organization, questions of research and its effectiveness and its outcomes, all right? You really have to spend some time not just doing the research, but living with universities and appreciating the loss of human potential, like what it is that's being squandered there, to realize that, from my perspective at least, the best run universities are something like the best run tyrannies, the best run despotism, in that there's something terrible and tragic being lost at all times, even when there's nothing in particular going wrong. Now, on university campuses, nobody starves to death, right? Universities don't produce their own food. Yeah, we don't run farms the same way we run universities. We don't run supermarkets the same way we run universities. However, if you look at the finances of any given university, and you look at it, the university is a sort of miniature society dealing with just a few problems, in a very select and narrow way. So, well, they don't have to deal with food, they don't have to deal with generating electricity, they don't have to deal with sewage treatment or providing running water. All the university has to do is provide a room with a chalkboard and a man or a woman who holds the chalk and stands there and gives a lecture, some chairs, right? Like, the responsibilities of the university really very narrow and very limited indeed. And yet, nevertheless, they're perpetually going bankrupt. They're perpetually demanding more money from the government, more money from their own students. And in a very real sense, when you run the numbers, they're bankrupting the whole of society. I wish I could say to you that we have a free, capitalist, democratic society that produces so much abundance that we can tolerate a kind of despotism within our society, namely the university campus. But we can't. It's bankrupting us all. It's not just student debt on an individual level. It's making beggars of the whole society. I remember reading an inquiry into fraud in the American university system. Who were the people who were basically doing elaborate paperwork to try to prove that their children were more poor than they actually are in order to get lower tuition in university? And this included things like people having their own servants adopt their children. Can you imagine doing this? In the United States of America, wealthy people putting down on paper that they are not the child's parent, but their housekeeper, their nanny, their mechanic, their driver is legally the child's parent, having phony adoptions like this. Now, what this report discovered or concluded is it is not the poor who are defrauding the university system this way. It's millionaires, but it's people who have just $1 million to their name. It's people who have only a few $1 million to their name. Because if you have 5 kids and you are talking about university tuition of minimum $50,000 per year per child, and the real cost could be in the United States $100,000 per year, right? Even if you are a millionaire, even if you are a multimillionaire, right? This can bankrupt you. This can ruin you. And these are people, some of them, who are willing to engage in more or less elaborate fraud to try to get their children an education despite that. So a democracy, can it tolerate, in this sense, a despotism? And let me ask you, very simply, if a university were run on democratic principles, for whom would it work? Who would it serve? Not the professors, not this tiny elite of the president of the university and a small coterie of his colleagues, right? If a university were run on democratic principles, it would serve the students and it would serve the demands of society as a whole. Now, in the same way that at the beginning of this video I said to you, there are these very obvious fundamental questions that just don't get asked in non-democratic society. In Myanmar, nobody's allowed to ask about electricity generation. Nobody's able to debate these things and criticize the government and so on. The questions don't get asked, so the quality of government necessarily is very, very poor. I would point out to you that all of the most important questions in universities cannot get asked, right? The university wants to make as much money as possible by giving as many PhDs as possible to people in history. Canada, 30 million people. How many people with PhDs in history can we possibly employ? How many dentists? How many engineers? When you just ask, wait, what's the strategy here? Who decided how many resources would go into teaching each subject and how many seats there would be, like how many places there would be for students in each area of expertise and specialization? Guess what? For the whole of the United States and Canada, the Western European democracies, there is no plan. Right? This was handed over to a self-serving, non-democratic elite to pursue their own self-interest in, to just do whatever would make them the most money or whatever be the least work, whatever they would find the most gratifying. This is the way universities are operated in our part of the world. And as a result, obviously, even the best universities are producing people with the wrong credentials. And in many cases, they're producing people with hollow credentials. We did a lot of research in the last 2 years about business schools and about credentials very closely linked to the stock market. I'm using this wording because there's more than one term for this. Becoming a stockbroker in plain English, which can fall under several different headings, not necessarily the study of economics, not necessarily the study of business. I'm somebody with a background in Buddhist research. I studied Cree and Ojibwe, First Nations languages. I have studied some things that are very obscure and marginal and that nobody makes money out of studying, right? So when I turn my attention to something relatively mainstream and with a lot of money involved, I think, oh, okay, so the defects and problems of academic organization, I'm not going to find them at all over here now, right? Now we're talking about business school. Now we're talking about the stock market. And I find exactly the same tragic problems of organization. I can see that these are institutions that do not work for the service of the students. They do not work for the service of society. They do not function in a democratic manner at all. They work in the interests of a power elite at the top. Those people may not perceive themselves as an elite. Pardon me. Those people may not perceive themselves as an aristocracy. The students may not perceive them as and may not resent them as some kind of oppressive elite, right? But nevertheless, in the function of the institution with time, that is indeed what they are. And you can tell by the outcomes, right? When you look at the progress of society in Thailand, contrasted to Laos, still a communist dictatorship to this day, contrasted to Cambodia, formerly a communist dictatorship, now just a corrupt capitalist dictatorship, contrasted to Myanmar, history of which I've already summarized in this video, okay? What was the advantage that Thailand had for all those years? And there are a lot of disadvantages with Thailand, including a terrible university education system, by the way. You know, it's not the case that government is merely as good as the people who happen to participate in it. Right? It's not the case that a despotism is as good as the 10 or 20 guys at the top making the policy and doing the research and making the decisions, nor that a democracy is as good as the 3,000 people who are really participating. In many cases, it may only be a few thousand, or the 30,000, or the 300,000, or the 3 million. However many millions, it's not the case that democracy is as good as those participants, right? Because what you have in democracy is a much greater capacity for doubt, for questions and challenges to be raised, right? For government to recognize problems with what it's doing, problems with society as a whole. For the whole of society's curiosity to be canvassed, to be harnessed, to be engaged in the question of, how is this university supposed to work? What is this supposed to be? And for people to voice the opinion, this is intolerable. It's intolerable to spend $100,000 a year and get nothing in return. Or in Myanmar, in the humble village, for people to say, it's intolerable that the next town over has electricity and we don't. On this simple level, you know, yes, having procedures in government that allow and instigate and encourage dissent, that give everyone the opportunity to doubt and question and make proposals and examine what's wrong with society, right? That is an advantage that, with the passage of time, explains the remarkable contrast between the communist countries of Eastern Europe and the democracies that in some cases were physically on the map, culturally and linguistically, right next door to them. It explains the vibrancy of Thailand as a society today, in contrast to Laos next door. It explains the depth of the difference that we see now between North Korea and South Korea, two countries that linguistically and culturally were completely homogenous before they took separate paths, one democratic, the other despotic.